In a small village along the lush riverbanks of West Africa, life moved to a steady rhythm. Traders filled bustling markets, their voices blending with the soft clinking of gold and spices being exchanged. Children ran barefoot through the fields, their laughter echoing beneath the shade of ancient trees. Elders sat by, their stories flowing like the river. Tales of ancestors, survival and wisdom passed through the generations. These communities thrived on trust, family and a deep connection to the land. The fields were abundant and the people were strong. Every day was marked by the steady beat of drums, a rhythm that carried their history, their culture, their unity. But one day, that rhythm faltered. Strange ships appeared on the horizon. At first they seemed like curious visitors, offering new goods and opportunities. But beyond those unfamiliar sails lay something far darker. As the ships drew nearer, the familiar sounds of daily life, the laughter, the songs, the drums, were drowned out by the clanking of chains. This was the beginning of a trade that would tear families apart, fracture communities, and forever alter the future of these lands. The transatlantic slave trade had begun, and with it the lives of millions would be stolen, reduced to commodities in a brutal system of exploitation. In this episode, we'll explore the key forces behind the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, how European colonization, the relentless demand for labour, and shifting trade with Africa led to one of history's darkest chapters. We'll also examine the systems that justified this exploitation and the lasting impact it left on both Africa and the New World. To understand the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, we must first look at the events that led European powers to the shores of the New World. In the late 15th century, nations like Spain and Portugal, driven by their thirst for wealth and empire, embarked on ambitious voyages of exploration. These expeditions were not just about discovery, they were about conquest and resource extraction, laying the groundwork for a system that would ultimately depend on human exploitation. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, reached the Americas. His arrival marked the beginning of Spain's rapid colonization of the Caribbean, Central and South America. Spanish conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro would soon overthrow powerful empires like the Aztecs and the Incas, flooding Europe with gold and silver. Meanwhile, Portugal claimed Brazil, transforming its fertile lands into sugar-producing plantations. As these European colonies grew, so did their economies. Built on the backs of large-scale agriculture and resource extraction, sugar, tobacco and cotton plantations spread across the Caribbean, Brazil and parts of North America. But the European settlers soon realized that this economic expansion required something critical: labor, vast amounts of it. At first, they turned to the indigenous populations, including the Caribs of the Caribbean, the Inca of South America, and various Native American tribes in the north. The Spanish introduced the encomienda system, which allowed settlers to compel indigenous people into labor with the promise of protection and Christian conversion. However, this reliance on indigenous labor quickly proved unsustainable. European diseases such as smallpox, influenza and measles decimated entire indigenous communities. The Taino in the Caribbean were nearly wiped out, and the once great empires of the Aztecs and Incas were devastated. As native populations dwindled, European settlers were left with vast plantations and no workforce to sustain them. Desperation set in. European colonial economies, especially the booming sugar plantations, needed a new stable labour force. As indigenous labour forces continued to collapse, European settlers turned their gaze to Africa, where they saw an opportunity to exploit a seemingly endless supply of human beings. What began as small-scale trading with African kingdoms soon grew into a vast system of human trafficking. By the early 16th century, the first ships carrying enslaved Africans arrived in the New World, bound for Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Portuguese plantations in Brazil. These early voyages laid the foundation for the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would transform millions of lives and generate untold wealth for European empires. The demand for labour in the New World had sparked a cruel and unrelenting enterprise, one that would span continents and centuries, forever shaping the history of Africa, Europe and the Americas. The European quest for empire had now evolved into a system that saw human beings as commodities, an industry built not just on the exploitation of land, but on the enslavement of millions. Early interactions with Africa. Africa, long before the arrival of European traders, was home to a diverse and thriving range of societies. From the coastal kingdoms to the vast empires of the interior, African civilizations were deeply connected to the land, their traditions, and one another. Families lived off the abundance of the land, cultivating crops, crafting intricate art, and building vibrant communities. Music, particularly drumming, was central to daily life, an expression of both communication and celebration. Across the continent, art, trade, and spirituality flourished, creating a web of cultures that thrived for centuries. African societies were rich with knowledge and culture. The kingdoms of West Africa, such as Mali, Benin, and Dahomey, were known for their sophisticated governance and thriving economies. Mali's capital, Timbuktu, was a centre of Islamic learning, where scholars from across the world gathered to study philosophy, mathematics and law. Meanwhile, Benin was renowned for its metalwork, including the intricate Benin bronzes, which reflected the kingdom's history, deities and royal power. These societies, though diverse, were unified by strong social structures and a deep sense of community. Trade was a cornerstone of life in many African kingdoms. For centuries, African merchants had engaged in long-distance trade, exchanging gold, ivory and salt with North African and Middle Eastern traders. The wealth and resources of these kingdoms made them influential in the global economy, and their political systems were often just as complex as those of their European counterparts. African leaders were powerful figures, and their influence extended beyond the continent through trade networks that connected them to the wider world. However, beneath the surface of these flourishing societies, a darker transformation was beginning. The arrival of European traders, initially seen as a means of prosperity, gradually shifted the focus from the exchange of goods like gold and ivory to something far more sinister: human lives. The demand for labour in the New World was insatiable, and soon African leaders found themselves entangled in a system that would fracture their communities and forever alter the course of their history. At first, European traders were eager to exchange goods, firearms, textiles and alcohol for African resources. Fortified trading posts like the Elmina Castle became bustling centres of commerce where African and European merchants negotiated as equals. Yet, as European colonies expanded and the need for labour grew, the nature of this trade began to shift. The drums that once called people to celebrate now signalled something darker, as the focus turned to the capture and sale of human beings. Many African leaders, faced with the growing demand from European traders, found themselves forced into a terrible choice. Some, like the rulers of the Kingdom of Congo, resisted the increasing pressure to participate in the slave trade, understanding the destruction it could bring to their people. But others, lured by the promise of wealth and European goods, especially firearms, which were crucial for maintaining power in regional conflicts, entered the trade. What had started as a system of exchange became a cycle of violence and exploitation. Wars between African kingdoms intensified, driven not only by political rivalries but also by the demand for captives to sell to European traders. The Oyo Empire and the Kingdom of Benin, once proud centres of culture and power, became entangled in this growing market for human lives. Entire communities were raided, families torn apart, and survivors marched in chains to coastal forts like Elmina, awaiting the terrifying journey across the Atlantic. The violence and devastation caused by the transatlantic slave trade cannot be overstated. For those captured, the trauma of being torn from their homeland, separated from their families, and sold into a life of brutal labour was only the beginning. African societies, once defined by cultural richness and complex social structures, were now being fractured by a system of exploitation they could not control. What had once been prosperous kingdoms were reduced to shadows of their former selves, as the relentless demand for labour in the New World devoured their people. The origins of slavery in Africa. Slavery existed in Africa long before Europeans arrived, but it's important to recognise the nature of the slavery in Africa was vastly different from the chattel slavery that would later emerge under European control. In African societies, slavery was often a result of war, debt, or punishment for crimes, and it followed complex social and cultural rules. Enslaved individuals were still seen as part of the community. They could marry, own property, and even rise to positions of influence within their societies. African slavery was not hereditary. The children of enslaved individuals were not automatically enslaved themselves. In West Africa, for example, captured prisoners of war were often enslaved, but they had rights and could integrate into the broader society. The practice was far from ideal, but it bore little resemblance to the dehumanizing system of chattel slavery that Europeans would later impose. African slaves were often treated as individuals with potential roles within the social fabric, rather than as property that could be bought and sold without any rights or recognition of humanity. Additionally, African societies had also encountered Arab traders long before Europeans arrived. Beginning in the 7th century, Arab merchants were involved in the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades, where African captives were transported across the Sahara to North Africa, or through coastal routes to the Middle East and beyond. Though this trade was exploitive, it still allowed enslaved individuals certain rights and paths to freedom. In some cases, they could rise to positions of power, such as military or administrative roles. The Zani rebellion in 9th century Iraq, led by African slaves, demonstrated that enslaved people could mobilize and challenge their conditions. However, the European system of slavery introduced a far more brutal and dehumanizing form of exploitation. When Europeans arrived in Africa, they found these existing systems of servitude and quickly transformed them into something far more devastating. European demand for labour in the New World required a permanent, hereditary system of slavery, one that reduced African people to commodities, valued only for their ability to produce wealth for European plantations. This marked a profound shift in the way slavery operated on the continent. The Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, the British and the French, expanded their involvement in the African slave trade, escalating it from a localised practice into a global system of human trafficking. Coastal forts that once traded in gold and ivory, such as Elmina Castle, were repurposed into holding pens for captured Africans awaiting the long journey to the New World. These Africans were not slaves in the traditional African sense. They were treated as chattel, subjected to horrific conditions and stripped of their humanity. As European demand for labour grew, African leaders who had previously engaged in local trade or occasional conflict found themselves increasingly entangled in a system driven by European greed. Some African rulers, tempted by European goods, especially firearms, began to raid neighbouring communities to capture prisoners solely for sale to European traders. Others resisted, recognising the destruction this new system would bring to their people, but the tide of violence and exploitation was impossible to stop. Regardless of the forms it took, slavery in any context represents one of the greatest injustices against humanity. Though African systems of servitude were exploitative, they bore little resemblance to the brutal chattel slavery introduced by Europeans. The European system was unprecedented in its scale, cruelty and impact. What had once been a complex system of social servitude in Africa was now transformed into an industrial-scale operation that tore millions of people from their homeland and condemned them to lives of unimaginable suffering. Legal foundations of the slave trade. As the demand for labour in the New World exploded, European powers moved to formalise the vast systems of human trafficking that would define the transatlantic slave trade. The exploitation of African people wasn't just an informal practice, it became embedded in the legal, political and economic structures of emerging European empires. What was once a series of transactions grew into a global industry, sanctioned by governments and backed by religious institutions. One of the earliest justifications for the slave trade came from the Catholic Church itself. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversas, granting the King of Portugal the right to conquer and enslave non-Christians. This decree framed the enslavement of Africans as a moral duty to spread Christianity. 3 years later, the Bull Romanus Pontifex reinforced this, encouraging European nations to expand into Africa and enslave its people. These papal endorsements gave European monarchs and traders the moral and religious justification they sought to enslave African people and build their empires. Portugal was one of the first nations to exploit this papal approval, using it to establish a foothold in West Africa. By the early 16th century, Portuguese traders were shipping enslaved Africans to their colonies in Brazil and the Caribbean, setting the precedent for other European powers. This system laid the groundwork for a vast network of human trafficking that would soon spread across the Atlantic. Spain quickly followed suit, formalizing its involvement in the slave trade through the Asiento system. Under this legal framework, private companies and individuals were granted exclusive rights to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's colonies in the Americas. The Asiento transformed the slave trade into a highly organized and profitable enterprise, with European merchants competing fiercely for lucrative contracts. What had begun as a series of ad hoc transactions evolved into a massive state-sponsored industry. As the demand for enslaved Africans grew, other European powers such as Britain and the Netherlands established their own monopolies on the trade. The Royal African Company, chartered by the British in 1672, was granted exclusive rights to trade enslaved Africans to British colonies. Similarly, the Dutch West India Company played a central role in capturing and selling Africans to Dutch colonies. These companies, backed by the respective governments, operated with full legal authority, transforming the enslavement of Africans into an official state policy. In European colonies, laws further cemented the status of enslaved Africans as property. One of the earliest and most notorious legal frameworks was the Barbados Slave Code of 1661, which reduced enslaved Africans to mere property, granting them no rights and subjecting them to brutal treatment. This legal precedent spread across the Caribbean and the Americas, ensuring that European settlers could control their enslaved workforce with impunity. Under these laws, Africans were not recognized as human beings, they were commodities, bought, sold, and punished at the whim of their owners. The combination of religious justification, moral monopolies, and colonial laws allowed the transatlantic slave trade to flourish for centuries. Governments, churches, and merchants all profited from the forced labor of millions of Africans, embedding the trade into the global economy. These legal structures made the trade seem not only acceptable but inevitable, a cornerstone of European imperialism and economic growth. The harsh reality, however, is that these legal frameworks enabled one of the greatest crimes against humanity. The laws, contracts, and religious decrees that supported the trade reduced millions of Africans to mere commodities, fueling a system of exploitation that reshaped continents and forever altered the lives of countless individuals. Conclusion. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade reveal a devastating intersection of ambition, exploitation, and systemic cruelty. What began as a series of early interactions between African kingdoms and European traders quickly spiraled into one of the darkest chapters in human history. Driven by the insatiable demand for labor in the New World, European powers formalized the enslavement of millions of Africans through legal and religious frameworks that turned human beings into commodities. The Catholic Church's endorsement provided moral justification for the trade, while European monarchies created the legal infrastructure that embedded it into the global economy. Meanwhile, African societies were torn apart, their people captured and sold into bondage. The once thriving kingdoms of Africa found themselves trapped in a system of relentless exploitation, their social and cultural fabrics shattered. This episode has explored the key forces behind the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, from European colonization and the demand for labour to the systems that justified and sustained this brutal enterprise. But this is only the beginning of the story. In the next episode, we will follow the harrowing journeys of those captured and transported across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, where millions suffered unimaginable horrors on their way to life of forced labour in the Americas. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to echo through history. Its impact cannot be undone, but it must be understood. As we move forward, we will confront the full scope of this tragedy, honour the stories of those who lived through it, and reflect on the lasting consequences that still shape our world today. If you found this documentary informative, please subscribe, like and share to help this channel grow, so we can continue bringing you more in-depth stories and explorations of history.